Welcome to the video on the poem Kamikaze from the Poetry Anthology. Here on this front screen we have some imagery relating to kamikaze pilots which help us to understand the title of the poem, but we will look a little bit further at the context later on. So here we go. I'm going to read the poem to you in just a moment, but as I'm reading, I want you to look at the poem and take 5 minutes just afterwards to write down as many things as you notice about particularly the structure, so stanzas, lines, punctuation, form, and presentation as I read. So here we go. Kamikaze by Beatrice Garland. Her father embarked at sunrise with a flask of water, a samurai sword in the cockpit, a shaven head full of powerful incantations, and enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. But halfway there, she thought, recounting it later to her children, he must have looked far down at the little flung boats strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea, and beneath them, arcing in swathes like a huge flag waved first one way, then the other in a figure of 8, the dark shoals of fishes, flashing silver as their bellies swiveled towards the sun, and remembered how he and his brothers, waiting on the shore, built cairns of pearl-grey pebbles to see whose withstood longest the turbulent inrush of breakers, bringing their father's boat safe, yes, grandfather's boat, safe to the shore, salt-sodden, awash with cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of white bait, and once a tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. And though he never came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes, and the neighbours too. They treated him as though he no longer existed. Only we children still chatted and laughed, till gradually we too learned to be silent, to live as though he had never returned, that this was no longer the father we loved. And sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. Okay, so if you can pause now and have a look particularly at the structure of the poem. We're going to go through that in just a moment. So let's have a look at some of the things you should have noticed. So firstly, there are 7 stanzas. Make of that what you will, but 7 is obviously how many days we have in a week, so it could represent some kind of movement of time. And there are only 3 sentences in the whole poem, which is unusual. In particular, the first sentence is incredibly long. So we are going to look into that just later on. There are 6 lines in each stanza, so it is a regular line patterned for each stanza. There are no rhyme or regular rhythmic pattern in this poem, which makes it free verse, which means it has almost a narrative feel, as if somebody's sitting telling you a story rather than a formulaic poetry pattern. There's mixed use of italicized wording and ordinary text. So italics are normally for emphasis on emotion, but we're going to look into the meaning of these particular italicized words later on. There's only 20 commas in the whole poem as well, so it's not just a short amount of sentences. However, the most amount of commas are found in stanza 5, where we have the listing of the different types of fish. So we might make something of that too. So what does this tell us about this use of structure? What does it help us to understand? Well, firstly, sentence 1 covers the first 30 lines and 5 stanzas. Why though? What could that represent? Sentence 2 is 10 lines and 1.5 stanzas. The poet begins talking from her own perspective. It becomes a first person sense here. What element does that bring to the poem. If I told you there are two narrative voices in this poem, and the second sentence is that italicized information, that might help us to work it out. And finally, the third sentence is that final two lines. It's powerful and quite brutal and quite shocking at the end of the poem. We also go back to that third person narrative. We talk about her rather than I. So what can we read into that? So now we're going to look at the form and context. This will help us with our about section and help us to kind of understand logistically what's happening in the poem. So you can make notes after this slide. So Kamikaze is a narrative poem, as we've discussed. It's free verse. It tells us, the readers, a story of the narrator's grandfather, who was a kamikaze pilot in the Second World War. Now, the granddaughter is the person who directly addresses us in the italicized sections of text. She talks from her own point of view. But we start off at the beginning from this third person, almost narrative, who's talking about her, who is the granddaughter, and we don't know who that person is. So we have that first full sentence telling us this removed tale about how the granddaughter feels. Then the granddaughter interjects briefly with, yes, grandfather's boat, and then we go back again to that other narrator. So we switch. Now, kamikaze pilots used to sacrifice their lives by flying their planes directly into their targets. In Japan, this was respected and admired. They were, by all intents and purposes, suicide bombers. When the pilots left their home, it was unequivocally known that they would not return, but the families were proud of this honour being bestowed upon them. It was something that was respected, that was honoured for them to do with their lives. In this poem, though, the pilot sets off and the narrator begins to recount the story that her mother told of the speculation of the journey. They didn't actually know what had happened, but this is how they justified to themselves what he must have felt or seen to make him change his mind and return to them. Then he returns. We learn then he's the narrator's grandfather. He's disowned by the family, and gradually all of the family, including her as a child, eventually ignore and stop loving him, which makes that end line more and more shocking. So we need to think about some things with this poem. This context will help us to understand the poem, but it also helps us to think about how this poem is relevant to a modern audience. Are there any links, perhaps, to current situations? Do we learn things as a result of reading this that we could talk about in our response to the poem? Also, what does this tell us about families and the distress that war can cause? In this sense, by not participating in the war as was deemed proper by their society, he has caused more distress than actually by dying. These are all quite big things to think about when we look at this poem. Before we look at some of the lines in detail, I'd like you now to have a look at the poem and make notes about key imagery and techniques, connotations that are made as a result. Try to find at least 3 per stanza. So for example, you could pick the word fishes. Fishes, one of a number, plenty more fish in the sea, part of a community. Shoal. So you have lots of connotations with that word. Then you've got also bunting. Okay, bunting suggests parties. It's very welcoming. It's happy. It makes you think about summer and sunshine. It's celebratory. So using the connotations of those words, you can then start to build a bigger picture. So looking at that imagery, you can see how you can relate it to the content. So I've picked out fishes. here. So I've got the pilot is just one of a number of other people in the world, but he belongs to his family. Fish live in shoals. This represents the pilot's longing to be back within his community and be accepted, not heading off to die. Fish symbolise abundance and plenty, but this man feels alone, and this could represent the trigger for his cowardice. So what I'd like you to do is have a look at each stanza, pick out 3 key images or similes or metaphors or techniques in that stanza, and then think about the hidden meaning, how that can relate to the content of the poem. Okay, so here are some photos, some images that are present in this poem. What I'd like you to do is match each photograph, each image, to a line in the poem. It will help you to collect key quotations that you can discuss, but also help you to visualize some of this imagery that is presented by the poem. So you have here 7 images, which will give you 7 different quotations. If you can annotate your poem or write those down in your books, and then we can move on. Here we have 3 different questions which will help you to make notes and think about this poem and how you might write about it in the future. So all 3 are valuable, but you can just pick one for now to help you revise. So the first one, what influence does structure and form have on our interpretation of this poem? You need to think about how the poem's laid out and what this does to us as a reader, and those 2 different narrative voices. Think about the punctuation, the use of the italics to differentiate the 2 voices, and how that ties in with the themes represented in the poem. The second question is, why is this poem important in highlighting conflict within families following participation in war? You need to think about the context here and what the poet's overall intention might be by getting us to think about society differently to our own. So thinking about Japanese culture rather than our westernized view. You need to think about themes of war and conflict, how this poem helps to tackle those themes and to present them. And the third question, how does the poet use imagery to communicate how the pilot and family members feel within this poem? So this is thinking about mood and tone. Think about imagery we've looked at from those pictures earlier, how we can link that to emotions and feelings of the characters in the poem. So we have the 2 narrative voice characters, but we also have the character of the pilot themselves and what they presume he must have felt as he was on his voyage and turned back. Think as well why the poet has chosen these specific images and what they infer to the reader. I'd like you to have a go at one of those questions, please. Now here's a model example. This is a good example. It's not a top response, but let's have a look at it together and see what's good about it. So, in Kamikaze, imagery is used to tell us how the people in the poem feel. The poem has many images in it that document the feelings of the kamikaze pilot who returns from his voyage unhurt and his betrayed family. When he is looking out of the window, we are told he sees shoals of fishes. This imagery usually makes us think about the fish and how they represent people. They are in a shoal or community. This is linked to the pilot's feelings of fear and distress about his journey and no longer being with his family and being separate from them. So think about what's good about that paragraph, but also what you would need to do to improve it. Here is an improved paragraph. So let's have a look at this one and see if we can work out what is better. In the poem Kamikaze by Beatrice Garland, there are many examples of imagery being used to communicate how the characters feel. The narrative poem tells us the story of a kamikaze pilot who, while on his final voyage, has a change of heart and returns to his family, who subsequently disown him. In the third stanza, we are described the view that the pilot may have observed from his cockpit window. The view contains dark shoals of fishes that are swirling below. The imagery here could represent the pilot's feelings of belonging. He, like the fish, is one of a number of people in the world, but he has a family or shoal of his own. This visual reminder of family is poignant here and represents the character's longing to be back within his community and accepted, not heading off to die. Fish symbolize abundance and plenty, but this man feels alone, and this represents the trigger for his cowardice. This imagery tells the reader that he longs to be part of his family the most, which makes the reader feel sympathy for the pilot and understand the reasons for his return to his family. What I'd like you to do is compare this example to the last example and notice what is improved about it. Equally, is there anything else you would add to elongate or better this example? Now that we've had a look at some extended pieces of writing and you've had a go at your own, I'd like you to look back across your notes and make sure that you have enough information to be able to complete an amity on this poem. Once you've completed that and you have all your notes made out and you've annotated your poem, the next thing to do and the final thing to do is think about how this particular poem links to other poems in the anthology. I've got some ideas here, but you may want to link it to a different poem of your own choosing, and it's about feeling comfortable with those links and which poems you would connect together. But for some examples, you could link this to the Imagery. The Imagery is a poem about identity that's linked to her country, or rather the lack of identity that she feels now she's been removed from it. It also deals with the theme of memory and reminiscing, much like this poem. There's also checking out my history. Identity and culture is definitely a key theme in that poem. And upbringing, how important your upbringing and your identity is to your future self. You've also got Poppies. This has the impact of war on family, told from a mother's perspective rather than the daughter's talking about her father. So there's nice links there between those two. It also deals with memories because she remembers her son when he was young, rather than thinking about what possible memories the father might have had before he made his choice, or grandfather. Then we have Remains. Remains deals with the aftermath of war on those left behind and how the people not directly experiencing the event can be affected. So we have then the soldier who survived but has to deal with the recurrence of that memory and how it affects him. Here, the pilot makes a choice and that choice has repercussions, not just for him but for his family. Finally, you could make a link to Charge of the Light Brigade. It's almost opposite, because of the Charge of the Light Brigade, we are told that we need to remember them and honour them. And here, in Kamikaze, it is the opposite. He is dishonoured, he is forgotten as a result of his lack of honour. So you can make contrasts there between the patriotism and the lack of patriotism. Anyway, jot some of those down and think about which poems you would link to this one. And that's the end of this for today. Thank you.